Gino, Canessa. I'm with Microsoft on the Healthcare Standards and Interop team. And if you're talking to Microsoft people, we are the Madison, Wisconsin team, better than the Redmond teams. We're going to talk today about subscriptions, particularly in the context of R5. And I'll get into a little bit of history as to why that's so important, but suffice to say it is. Format stuff, I've saved 5 to 10 minutes for questions. By default, I'll talk through and there'll be time at the end, but please, if something doesn't make sense, needs more clarification, you have a question, just jump out in the middle. I prefer interactive over talking at you for 30 minutes, so please feel free. The link here, aka.ms/DevDaysGino, that has it's a OneDrive folder that has this presentation and then the deck for the Let's Build that's right after this. There are a lot of links that I'll have throughout the presentation, so you might want to go there and grab them if you are interested in following that. And it's easier to read the text on your own computer anyway. Let's see. My clicker died when we did all this. Okay, we'll do this. So, subscriptions. Very simple concept. You want to say, something's changed and I need to know about it. Not only is it a simple concept, but it's something that a lot of workflows depend on. And so any of the developers here are probably thinking, oh, widely needed thing that's very easy to describe, it's going to be a mess. Yeah, it pretty much is. So lucky for us, way back in the DSTU2 days, they figured out that this was going to be needed. So they said, this needs to be in, we'll build it, and we'll be happy. During this time, between DSTU2 and R4, they found out a few other things about it. So the first is, if you have user interfaces and you're doing a workflow and you need this closed loop of communication, that's a little different. It's not subscriptions as we're thinking about it here. So that forked off into CDS hooks. If that's what you're looking for, Dennis Patterson is doing that downstairs right now, so you won't offend me if you run down to that one instead. At the same time, they also figured out that sometimes you have multiple applications on a single device, and you want to keep them in context with each other. Again, very specific needs, very different type of data, and that split off into Firecast. So while all this was happening, the main subscriptions kind of sat there because people were figuring out what it isn't. As it got through R4, they said, now we're really going to push on this, and found some problems. So the way it was defined in DSTU2 on was the client just presents a query and says, anytime this result set changes, let me know. Great when you start off and say, I want to know about new encounters. Server says, resource type encounter is created. I let you know, we're done. Then you could say, well, I can query for encounters on patient 123. Okay. I can let you know, new encounter resource has the encounter.subject as patient 123. Not a big deal. Clients could then say, well, I want encounters for female patients. Server had to say, well, new resource, type encounter, follow the subject. If it's a patient, check and see if the patient has gender, female. Okay, maybe I'll support that. But you could keep going and say things like new encounters that have been diagnosed with X, or get really crazy and do things like, I want new encounters for patients that have had a particular diagnosis, been assigned a particular medication, had a certain procedure, have a certain allergy. No server is going to support that. So what would happen is, it just wouldn't work. And if this is what you were after as a client, you had to kind of step back one step at a time and see what you could get rid of to make it work. Not a great workflow. So while it looked great for clients, servers couldn't actually implement it performantly, and they couldn't implement it at scale. So a lot of the test servers did it, and that's why it lasted so long the way it did, is all the test servers could do it great, and all the pure FHIR servers in particular. But when you got into the facade servers and things like that, it just didn't work. There were also some other types of issues, like the delete and exclude. Since you're just querying for a result set, when something falls out of that set, Was it deleted, or did it change so that it's no longer part of your criteria? There was no way to tell. So, actually in April of this year, FHIR Infrastructure Group said, yes, this does not work. We need to do a redesign. So, try to do this as infrequently as possible in FHIR, but it was at the point where it needed to happen. Reset the maturity to 0 and said, let's figure this out. So I won't read through all the slide here, but they wanted to engage a lot of the community and really make sure that the second time was the charm instead of the third time. So in that link is the Argonaut subscription group. A lot of the accelerators had picked this up, so there's work that's done by Argonaut group, there's work in DaVinci group, and we've tried to kind of coordinate all of those things together. I linked to that document because it's a public document and you can see a lot of the history from when it started forward if you're interested in any of the whys of any decisions. But the goals were really to focus in on a couple of use cases and build a mechanism that works. In particular, we wanted to make sure it worked for on-premise, cloud, FastAid servers, FHIR servers. The same mechanism had to work across the board. So what were the goals? Well, don't poll. Seems obvious, but a lot of the situations that you end up in required polling to kind of recover out of it. But that's what we're trying to avoid. If you're polling, then you don't need subscriptions at all, and we can all save ourselves a lot of time. Wanted to make sure it was easy to implement for both clients and servers, and then also that they can figure out what happens between them. Consider a lot of these modern best practices, security, confidentiality, scale, all of these types of things that kind of have evolved since DSTU2 time. And this last one here, allowing clients to figure out that something's wrong. Errors can happen at a lot of points in workflows, especially when you start adding in actors over the internet and third parties and things like that. We can't prescribe reliable delivery, which I'll get into on the next slide, and so clients needed to be able to figure out, hey, something's missing. I mean, this is medical data, it's not your RSS feed for your favorite comic, so if you miss something, it could be very important. So, the excludes on the redesign. The first one is scope creep. Now that we do have CDS hooks and we do have Firecast and some of these other things in the space, we want to make sure that we're not encroaching on things that are solved already by them. Again, we couldn't require guaranteed delivery. A lot of the servers said, that's too much to manage. I can have N clients doing N subscriptions each, and for me to track every single message and make sure it was delivered and queue them if they aren't, that's not something that we can say is the minimum bar. And then the last one is unsolicited notifications. So we said all of the discovery and configuration has to be in-band. There's ways you can workflow around doing that, but it wasn't the primary goal. So that resulted in two major things. The first was the creation of a new resource called Topic, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It's a concept that you want to discover changes on. And then there were changes to the subscription resource. Most of them were around involving Topic, but some of them were other quality of life things to cover the things we talked about single event only, error detection, and things like that. Before I get too much further, this is one of those slides I was talking about links. So the specs are on build.fhir.org. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with that or not. I'm sure you're all familiar with hl7.org/FHIR, and that's the current released versions of the specs. Build.fhir.org is essentially the same thing for what's work in progress. So if you go there, you can see all the things that people are working on for R5. We make sure we push into that regularly, so it's always up to date, but it's not the published version that everyone can just look up and find. If you're here, you're probably interested in this. So I ask, please read it, review it, test it, play with it, whatever we can do. We're going to do some obviously in the next session. But the people who are involved are all people who've been involved for quite a while. And so whenever we get a chance to see someone who has not read the documentation, please capture any feedback you have, because we want to get this baked in for the first ballot in R5, which means we have to have everything locked down by January. Not very much time left, so please do that if you can. All right, So getting back to topics. A topic is just a way of defining the data and the change you're interested in. So a good example is the Argonaut project. We're defining the encounters IG, which is to say the start of a clinical encounter or the end of a clinical encounter. So you can see it's a well-defined concept. If I say that, everyone here knows what that means. You may or may not know how to implement it in a server, but you know the data you're actually after. So some of these things are just in how you define them. They can be computably defined. So if you have a pure FHIR server that'll let you define new topics, that's available, or not, depending on the server implementation. There can be canonical ones or locally defined ones. And this trick here, the topic actually defines what you can filter on. So in the case of the clinical encounter that we were just talking about, sometimes my click works, sometimes it doesn't. There we go. This is an example from the draft that I was saying, the Argonaut encounter topic. And this was draft whenever I was working on the deck, so it may be out of date. But that's there for an example. Next to it is from build.fhir.org. That's what the topic resource looks like. Looks scarier than it is, and that's because it's using this definition pattern. So it has a lot of things like copyright and jurisdiction and things like that that are supposed to be there on top of resources of this type, but especially when you're learning and playing with them, they are completely irrelevant. So looks worse than it is. The key things you can see here, URL. So in this case, we're doing a canonical URL. We have a nice title so that you can see what it means. And then there's kind of these two groups. One is the resource trigger. So in this case, we're saying this is based on encounters. And here are some computable definitions that may apply. So one is in query, so search type things, and one is in FHIR. The other group is the can filter by, and that's what I was talking about earlier. So you can see in this case, we're saying you can match on patient, and you can use either a direct match for a reference, or you can use this in, which is defined in R5 to be group membership. So that's how you can do things like care team notifications. You have a group for the care team, look for a patient that's in that care team group, and then you can do that. Again, the goal is that these can be defined by anyone. So please, if you are defining a topic, clearly specify what it is. We would recommend doing that in an IG or some other formal documentation, which sounds worse than it is. It's really not that bad of a process. And the goal is to make things that are broadly adopted. You want any client to be able to figure out that what they're trying to subscribe to exists, and then build their subscription on that. So along those lines, you can derive from other topics. So for instance, there's the encounter IG that we were just talking about, and you have a topic for the start of an encounter. But you say, well, I don't use that computable definition. Sure, make a new topic, derive from it, it's there. I want to add more filter options. I do want to allow people to check for patients who are female or patients that have a particular diagnosis. Okay, derive that topic, expose it on your server, and you're good. There are some things you can't do when you're deriving a topic, and that's just for client expectations. Don't remove filter options, because if you say the base topic said you can look for patient, and then you say, well, you can't look for patient anymore, clients will be very confused and nothing will work. And then don't change the concept. So if you're saying medication is similar, I want to know the start of a medication the same way I know the start of an encounter. You can see everyone's looking kind of funny. Exactly. Don't define those. So this is just some kind of more explicit things on what you can and can't do. So here's a sequence diagram. I'll use a few more of these throughout the deck here. Top down is time passing. You can see the actors and kind of the actions that are happening. It's a simple one because that's always best to start with. So for topic discovery, the server figures out which topics they want. The client can ask, do a search on topic. So again, if they know canonical URLs, they can search for those. So they can say, I'm looking for things that are based on this particular topic. And then the client can figure out which ones they want to subscribe to. So what is a subscription? Well, a subscription is just kind of the instance of saying, I want notifications on this topic. It can contain the filters. So in this case, we said the topic, you can filter by the patient ID. Well, subscription is the one that says, yes, I actually want to filter on patient 123. And then it also has to contain the information on how to present the subscription. So channel and payload information. Channel, again, fairly straightforward. It's just a method of communication. So the channel describes, there's a field called endpoint, and it describes what information's there. And these are extensible. So we've gone and defined some common ones. We'll get to on the next slide. But the idea is if you have a system where you want end-to-end encryption over a message queue, you can define that as channel. And then anyone who can follow those rules can use that channel to talk to your server. Same type of thing, define it. Please define it formally. Let other people use your work because that's better for everybody. So the ones that are in the spec right now, REST hook, by far the most commonly requested. Your endpoint is an HTTPS or HTTP listener. I would again recommend using HTTPS, and notifications get posted to that. WebSocket, a client connects to the server via WebSockets and receives notifications that way. And then this last one is email, which most of the people who have asked for that are in public health, that you say, I want to be notified via, like there's a new outbreak of a particular disease. They don't have endpoints listening for those things. So they say, hey, just put it in an email, let us know, we'll contact you and take it from there. So it sounds like a very obscure thing, but it actually has a very valid use case. So what actually gets sent? We call these notification bundles just for talking about them, but what they actually are history bundles. If you're interested in why we chose history, there has been a lot of discussion about it. It's in the Argonaut document some and FHIR notes and different things like that, but it just has to do with what you can and cannot do in different types of bundles. We did define some extensions for the bundle so that it's much more useful in this context. Do note they are on the meta field. That's because bundles are, instead of being resources, they're actually domain resources, which means you can't put any extensions in the root. It's a weird FHIR internal thing. So frustrating, but that's what it is. The bundles are defined, and again, those are links to build.phir.org if you have the presentation up. And each one is described as an extension on bundle. They're pretty self-explanatory. Bundle event count, how many events are in this bundle. It's one of the things we were talking about, the quality of life things. If a server is doing high frequency notifications, they can say, well, I'm going to bundle all of the ones for 10 seconds together and send you one notification. Subscription event count, that's mostly for error detection. So that's the number of events that have been triggered on that subscription. And we'll get into the error detection and everything later. And then things like the subscription URL, topic URL, and status, just so the client can piece together what's going on. This other part is the payload. So in the bundle, there are entries, and those are controlled by those fields, which again, those are links to describing them in full documentation. But essentially, there we go. There's 3 types, and my awesome vehicle reference here should at least illustrate a little bit of what's going on. If you do an empty payload, there's nothing in there. So when you go to bundle.entries, it's just empty. You can do ID only. So bundle.entries just has something that points to the full resource URI, and you can retrieve it from there. Full resource includes the actual resource. So there we go. Again, easier to look at on your own. I apologize, but I wanted to be able to illustrate the differences between them easily. So in the empty payload, the server is sending the client a bundle that has all of the meta, all of the fields we filled out, the extensions we were talking about. And then the entries is just empty. When a client gets that, it's going to have to go and query the server, figure out what has actually changed. So it's just saying something changed that you were interested in. Client says, okay, well, what changed? Does the query, and then retrieves whatever resources it needs and does its processing. You can see the same thing in ID only. Now the entries has full URL, so the client doesn't have to query. It says, oh, just give me this encounter. That's what I was interested in, and it can do its processing. Finally, in the full resource version, it has not only the full URL, but the actual .resource is filled out, so the encounter is embedded in the bundle. The whys of this, again, that could be its own session on why we ended up with this, but essentially it comes down to privacy and PHI versus ease of processing. So if you have a server that's internal to your network and you're processing lab results, yeah, go ahead and do the full resource. You're in your network, you have mutual TLS, whatever you have, it's secure, you know where the data is going, no problem. If you're pushing out to your phone and you have a device that wants a notification, well, this is going over the public internet, it's going through Apple servers to convert it to a push notification. In HealthKit, for instance, they don't want PHI in there. So they're not going to even allow you to do this kind of thing because they don't want to be responsible. They're not a covered entity. They don't want to be a covered entity. They don't want PHI. So it's this balancing act between all these things. So now we have that. What does it look like? Well, again, like I said, the flowcharts get more and more involved as we go. So in this case, we can see we're using a REST endpoint and just another minutia. Whenever I show examples, I use JSON instead of XML because JSON's better. But same thing for the examples, I'm using REST hooks because that's the most common. So in this case, the client, whatever it is, has to set up this endpoint. And I mention it because the endpoint is a web server. So again, going back to our example of being on your phone, your device, you can't run a web server on your phone. So in this case, there needs to be something external that's going to receive that notification and convert it into something that works on the phone, like a push notification. HealthKit, Apple, they're very engaged in this, so they will likely have all that once it's done, but as they said in their demos, they can't comment on anything for the future, so you didn't hear that from me, and I won't commit to it. But in this case, the client then says, I want a subscription. Here's my endpoint, it's REST hooks, there's my filter, empty payloads that are coming across in application FHIR JSON. Great. Server says, you have requested this, and now I'm going to go and check with the client endpoint and make sure it exists. So there's a handshake that happens. All that is the same notification bundle with 0 events in it. How much or how little logic goes into this is up to the server to implement. So there might be very complex things where they're asking for a specific field back or different things like that, but in general we just said that's a server implementation and you guys can play with it however you like. Once the response is satisfactory, the subscription switch to active, and then you start getting your notifications. So missed events. This is difficult. Again, we would all like to prefer to live in a world where we just say everyone gets every event and we can always be sure of it, but the reality is that errors happen. We're dealing with the internet, we're dealing with multiple services on multiple devices. Errors will happen. So we want clients to be able to figure that out. So we kind of broke it into 2 sections. The first one is that subscription event count I was talking about earlier. So you can see in this case, the client got event 20, 21, 23. Well, there's something. It's out of sequence, it's missing, it's whatever. The client can see that pretty easily. It's a very low implementation bar. And then it can go and figure out what's going on. Now again, that's outside the scope of subscription to figure out what a client needs to do because we don't know what the client's doing. So in this case, for instance, it would say, give me all the encounters again for this patient and let me figure out what I was missing and kind of rebuild and then make sure everything's back in a working state. The other class, we didn't have any way of detecting. So same thing, we added a heartbeat mechanism. So when you're building your subscription, you say, what's the period timeout? So an hour, a day, whatever that is appropriate for your client. And the server sends a message, again with 0 events in it, just letting you know that the pipe is still working and the subscription's still active. So in this scenario, you can see the client got event number 20, and then whatever that time period was elapsed, and it didn't receive any communication. So in that case, we can go and look at the subscription. In this case, we found it was in an error state. Again, client can do it whatever it needs to rebuild from an error state and then set the subscription back to active so that it can continue. There's still some current discussions. So like I said, we want to have this locked down by January, but there's still some things being discussed in channels in particular, WebSockets. There's some security discussions. I don't know how many of you follow those channels on Zulip. Yes?
A question, when doing the handshake,
Yes?
how does the FHIR server authenticate with the client server?
Yes. So, yes. So the question was, during the handshake, how does the FHIR server authenticate with the endpoint? And that is one of our fun security discussions. There's a few classes of thought on this. The first attempt was putting some sort of token into the subscription, and there is a field in the subscription channel payload or channel called headers. And so you can set a header value that can be checked against. There's also been discussion about using the public keys that a FHIR server has to sign messages, and that way it can do some sort of challenge response with a client. In general, we're making note that that has to happen, and we have to leave it to implementers. And unfortunately, we can't specify more than that in the standard, because then we get into saying, oh, use this type of encryption with this type of key and everything else. We all know that gets outdated very quickly, and then we're going to be publishing technical corrections every time something's broken, and no one can implement the standard. So that's one of the things that's we've been sketching out in the documents and spending a lot of time on, is what kind of guidance can we give, and yet how far can we go? So I would encourage you to read the documents and find out. This is also linked. There's the security work group, and they're setting up a new call, and we're getting involved with that to say this type of thing, how can it be linked to the normal FHIR security guidance? So we are working on that. Please, we welcome more comments and review. So I'll say that. So getting back to some of the channel things, email, there's a lot of weird things that we've discussed with email. Again, it looks like it works. The people who have been interested say it works, but the more feedback we get, the better off we are. Some of these metric things, saying, for instance, a server should be able to describe how long does it take from an event happening to getting the notification, some sort of SLA or something like that. Everyone kind of wants something like that, but no one wants to describe it, so we're trying to figure that out. And then there are a couple of things that didn't actually make it into this slide even, that, for instance, there's the subscription event count, and in FHIR, the integer types are only 32-bit, and even on unsigned, you actually only get 31 bits of useful range, and that's not really sufficient for a long-running subscription. So we're trying to introduce a new 64-bit int type for R5 and things like that. So there's a couple of tweaks that are still happening, but generally it's, we think, very complete. So looking forward, obviously production implementations. There's been a lot of test implementations. We've been at Connectathons. Everyone seems happy, and I'll demo something here shortly, and then we'll do in the build later. And I mention this because if not, it always comes up, is graphs of resources. Everyone knows they want to be able to say, yes, I want an encounter, but can you return the encounter and the patient and whatever else? No one wanted to tackle it while we were trying to make the basic mechanisms work. So we have some ideas. There's been some discussions. Likely we'll put in an extension very soon that would allow for this, let people start playing with it, and then, depending on how long things take in ballot, either add it in R5 or it would be officially part of the standard after that. But we're also realistic. We know that no one can really wait for R5. A lot of these things are already being put into production today. So this link here is a guide that is still in draft state, but it is essentially just backporting the R5 subscription and topic into R4 using the basic resource, which if you're not familiar with the basic resource, it's just a resource that lets you put whatever you want in it, not as fields, but essentially as a string, serialized string. You could add more fields if you wanted to get crazy with extensions, but I wouldn't recommend it. So The short of the guide is just take the R5 subscription, serialize the JSON, and put it inside a basic. Same with that. And these are available on the test server that we maintain. So that test server here, this is all the information. All the code for it is all hosted in GitHub, so it's all broken up, what these pieces are. But the interesting link is the actual UI, which we'll see if I'm still connected to the internet. And, there we go. So I'll zoom in a little bit so that you guys can actually see what's happening. Oh, it did not. Let me drop this. Oh, it's going to make me put this on the other screen? No, perfect. Okay. So this is the test client that we've been working on for a while now. So we've used it at some connectathons, and I will even zoom it in more. And we're using it in the Let's Build after this. It's actually just this FHIR server URL that it's pointing to is a proxy we built. It's actually just pointing at the public happy server and intercepting things like topics and subscriptions so that they work there. You can set the authorization header for the endpoints like we were talking about, and just the general configuration things that you can play with. I will note specifically there's an option to use the backport to R4. So then instead of using topic and resource, it uses basics with the other things wrapped inside. And there are plenty of links down at the bottom. All the GitHub links, the build.fhir.org link, the connectathon tracks as we add those. There will be a connectathon in Baltimore, Maryland in January, a connectathon in Sydney in February. So all those links will appear here as they go with any additions they need. It's fairly straightforward. For instance, we'll look at the patient rest one because it's more interesting. There are a lot of documents describing the scenario since this was for a connectathon. But as you go through these steps, you can see that it'll tell you the request URL, what was actually returned. So in this case, we can see it's a FHIR bundle with one entry that's the topic, and then a nice representation of the info. And so these will let you go through the whole workflow and play. And in particular, you can then use those servers if you're building a client, or you can use this client if you're building a server. And that's really the goal of what this is here for. So as you move forward and build things, you should be able to use this to make sure it's working. So you can see here, we create a REST endpoint, and it has a URL and everything else. We can create a subscription. Scroll a lot because I'm so zoomed in. You can see the actual handshake that came across. So you can see there were 0 events in the subscription. There were 0 events in the bundle. The status was requested, etc., etc. And then even when you post an encounter, and then you get the actual notifications. So this is all here. It's all online. We maintain it. We update it periodically. And so that is there to play with. All right. Let's find where we were. So I kind of ended up talking at you anyway, so are there any other questions here? No.
Do you know what the timeline and predicted status for the vendors are?
The question was, do we know the projected timeline for vendors? Soon. The vendors we've been very pleasantly engaged with everyone. I'll get back to the question slide here. But we have, for instance, the Connectathon track in Sydney is actually being run by Cerner. Jenny Syed is running that. Cerner's been very involved. Epic's been very involved. We've had a lot of feedback from the Microsoft Azure FHIR team. We've had a lot of feedback from the Google Cloud team. So everyone's interested in getting this in. I can't give specific dates on when different vendors will have them, but soon. Yes, did you have a question too, sir?
Yeah, I mean, did I get it right? So the server predefines certain subscriptions. Did I get it right, or?
So the question was about what the server defines, and the server defines what topics it supports. So in this case, for instance, the one we were talking about for encounters, the server would say, I support the encounter topic. So that's something you can subscribe to. And this was very important for limiting what servers had to implement. Again, going back to the problems that were discovered in the earlier attempt, clients could just ask for anything. And either it worked or it didn't, but you didn't really know until you tried, and it was just a mess. So now we say, here's a topic, and if the server supports it, you can subscribe, and if you can't, no, it's just not there. Talk to your server and ask them to implement it. All right. Any other questions? I forgot to start my timer, so I don't know how we are on time, actually. Oh, 5 minutes? 4 minutes. Okay. So I can continue going through the demo or anything like that, or if there's anything else in specific people want to see. And, oh, yes, sir.
In the UK or in England, we've done an interesting thing with FHIR subscriptions where we're using them more in the messaging paradigm. Where
Yes.
we create a subscription and we just have a router that just accepts bundles in, matches the subscription and routes them on to subscribers. So it's a slightly different way of doing it. Has anyone else looked at doing something like that? Has that been discussed as part of this?
Yes, so the question here was about using messaging with subscriptions. And while I left it off my slides, it is actually defined as an option. There hasn't been a lot of feedback for it. And so we're a little leery of, is it well enough defined that we can make it a standard part of the resource, or would it be an extension? Either way will work. So we went through a similar thing with SMS messaging, actually. Graham Grieve likes the idea of SMS notifications as an admin, that, hey, my server has something and I need to check it. But there wasn't enough feedback, and so we said, well, that can be defined in an extension. So right now, messaging's there, but we don't have a lot of useful feedback. So if you're working through that today, please take a look at what's there, give us feedback, and we can, that's definitely been looked at. So, yes?
Is there any plan to have standard topics, like a set of topics that you recommend?
Yes. Yes, so the question was about standard topics in the FHIR spec, and so far, not in the core specification. The idea is in the implementation guides. So, for instance, there's a lot of talk about IPS core and things like that. So the idea would be that some of those would be included in there. Argonaut's defining some and things like that. So we want there to be all of those. Again, it's up in the air if they'll go in the actual spec, and I think there's an active discussion on that in the document that I linked to there. So we think it's useful. Is it something we can get away with putting in the spec itself? It's kind of a weird model. A lot of these things are, both for topics and for some of these third-party notification things. So there's a lot of things that we're kind of breaking new ground within FHIR. And so that's, we're trying to figure out also how much we can push. So we'll try. All right. If there are no other questions, then I will give you 2 minutes back, approximately, of time, and you can get downstairs before anyone else or try and maintain your seat. So thank you. There we go.